When I decided I was going to query my first book, I read almost every book on the subject. I was reading all the online forums, all the advice I could find. I revised it hundreds of times with beta readers and critique partners and friends and family. I even got a professional to look over it after winning a pitch contest. And even after all of that, I didn't get a single full request. Now, if you've been in the query trenches before, you probably know how heartbreaking the whole process is. And that's why this time, for this manuscript, I decided I was going to book a professional editor for my query package. In this video, I'm going to go through all of the details, talk about what I learned, whether it was worth it, and how to decide whether this would be right for you. The editor that I used was Gina Denny. She has a pretty popular TikTok page that I highly recommend you check out even if you're not looking to hire her. She has a lot of fantastic free advice and resources out there about the querying process and different advice on queries, synopses, etc. And she also does a series about free critiques for queries that are submitted onto her TikTok, and there's a lot of amazing advice out there. You can get really far just using that. I did her full pitch package where I submitted my synopsis, query, and first 10 pages and did 3 rounds of feedback on all 3 of those. The query letter had a max of 500 words, the synopsis 1,200, and then the first 10 pages 3,500. And for the 3 rounds of editing and the full package, it was $600 at the time. It has since been raised to $680. And what that looked like for me was $300 at the time that I booked her, and then $300 upon completion of the services. The timeline for a traditional pitch package review on her page, she says, takes around 2 weeks after the start. Mine took much longer, but that was mostly due to the time that I took in between rounds to implement the edits that she recommended. So what we were looking at for my timeline is around September to December. After each round, I took around a month each to fully digest all of the edits and then make changes. But part of this was because I had got some pretty big picture developmental edits that made me really rethink a lot of the things in my novel, which we'll dive into a little bit more when we're talking about the specific feedback that I got. Okay, so now to get into the specific feedback together, I brought out my laptop so I could have it up with me. The first round was very high level, looking at character motivation and the causality between the different events in the plot, and thinking about just very big picture, who is there, what's going on, is it immediately understandable, do the materials meld well together? Based on reading the synopsis and query, are the pages as would be expected based on how the information was presented in the more marketing materials? So the first feedback she started with was looking at these big 5 questions for the query letter, which is something that she mentions a lot in all of her different educational materials across platforms. But the first one is, who is the main character or protagonist? She answered Margot and Felix, which are my 2 main characters. What do they want to get into Potentia? What are they willing to do to get it? And then she's like, oh, they do kind of get it immediately. And this immediately showed kind of a misstep I had taken in my plot, and in particular in my query materials. Part of what I was struggling with this current novel is that there's a lot of mystery, and the world building is a little bit hidden and unraveled as the story progresses. And so my initial version of my query package definitely did not handle that well. And I'll talk a little bit about that with the synopsis too. The fourth one, what is standing in their way? Systemic barriers, their own ineptitude, other vaguely threatening stuff. Here again, I did a misstep where I think I was not nearly specific enough in the consequences and the things that are standing between them and their goals. And then what happens if they fail? And she says she has no idea. Yeah, she thinks they'll be fine. So the consequences weren't super clear since both my main characters do come from privilege. So she's like, I don't really know what would happen if they failed. Probably would be fine. There's a lot of line edits and questions she asked throughout the query as well. So looking kind of overall with the query, there was also a point where she said, for my comp titles, I had, compared to these 2, Blood Over Brighthaven and Gifted and Talented by Olivia Blake, and I had the reasons why, or the particular parts of that, like pulling this from that and this from that. And she said that, it's so immediately clear why those are related that I don't necessarily need to have the explicit reasons there. So I think unless your comp title is different or like a twist, a lot of people put things that are a little bit contrasting, then I think you don't really need any more justification there, like I didn't. Then when we're getting to the synopsis, here She said kind of overarching the goal is to have it demonstrate that you've written a complete story, and they need to understand what's going to happen with the novel without necessarily investing a bunch of hours. And so she said that there was a big unfocused feeling in my synopsis. She said there's a lot of events, but they don't really feel like a chain reaction. This happened and then that happened, but she really wants to see this happened, so then of course that happened, which I think is the missing link that I didn't have. Now, this is something that I've read in a ton of the different books, like I showed in the beginning. I mean, there's so many different craft books, and I've read a lot about plot and structure and things like that, and that's kind of always underlying all these different things. But I think with this novel, there's so many big overarching ideas I have, and again, with that kind of like hidden B plot, I think that wasn't dialed in enough where I could be really clear in my overarching plot why everything was happening and why it was driven particularly by our two main characters. And another good resource on this is the Second Story's YouTube channel. I think she has a fantastic video series about different mini arcs and how those kind of link together. So it was at this point that I discovered that, and I started doing some replotting based on that and making sure that everything was very, very causal so that the synopsis didn't read like, oh, event, and matching necessarily like the Save the Cat plot beats or the 5-act story structure, but more was particularly unique to the story, and that was driven particularly by the characters. And then I think she had a really helpful comment that, a few things. The plot feels like it's happened regardless of whether or not the characters making choices. So again, making sure that they're really the driving factor. She said that she feels like once the characters are dialed in, the plot will feel much more inevitable and natural. And definitely in these rounds of revision and sense, I have found that to be so, so helpful. I think I've always enjoyed character motivation and tried to learn a little bit more, but I think I'm doing it to another degree at this point after these rounds and after I've learned kind of all of this, because I think that's one overarching piece of feedback that I've never gotten from beta readers or critique partners, just because they don't have that level of view and that familiarity with reading hundreds and hundreds of synopses and queries, especially because synopses and queries are different fundamentally than reading a first chapter or reading part of your novel, because they're different types of writing. And so, on average, even if your friends have read a bunch of book blurbs, they probably haven't read these materials and don't know exactly what literary agents are looking for. So that's one reason why they are helpful. But she said every single character is a protagonist of their own story, and they have goals and needs that make all their decisions based on their goals and needs. And so actually, in my most recent video, I talked about how I was consolidating all of my research into one notebook. And what I've done is created a page for every single character in the story. And I have their backstory kind of written out, and then their goals and physical descriptors and things, which I have done in some different variations in Scrivener before, but I found it was super helpful to start rewriting it now. So that was kind of the biggest piece of feedback from this round that I found super helpful. But of course, there was also a lot of different line edits within the synopsis itself that were super, super helpful. I'm not going to show the exact line edits just because I don't want to spoil it, but I'll show a few examples. Then for the opening pages, she said there was a big disconnect between what she expected versus what the opening pages were like. So based on the query and the synopsis describing it as an adult fantasy novel, which is my plan, then the opening pages started off feeling a little middle grade, a little young. And I already did actually a few rounds on my first chapter and helped with the help of my community here. So that video is linked up here if you'd want to check that out. But the first pages, she said she's probably starting in a good place, but it really wasn't as character-driven as it needed to be, in that she felt like Margot was kind of very passive, and that even though Margot wanted some things, she wanted to go to the library, she never really got it, and we didn't see that. And it was too much info dumping, of course, and just like a convenient setting for that. Yeah, some disconnect between the other package materials and this, which was super helpful to find out through this, because again, when you're so close, it's very hard to identify that, so it helps to have a different perspective on all of it. So then, after taking a month to completely rewrite my opening pages and do a lot of character work for Margot and Felix, I came back with a new set and got my other round of feedback. Now, in my second round of feedback, she said she loved the opening pages, definitely more forward action, more of Margot is and who she and what she wants. But then there was a little bit of disconnect between Margot and Felix and their wants. She felt like they weren't necessarily tied together in the same story, which is something that I've always wanted since I first thought of this, is for them to have very parallel character arcs and to be kind of mirror reflections of one another. Then for the opening pages as well, she said that there was some choreography confusion, and then there were some missing weather details, but overall it was a little bit more dialed in. And then some more great line edits, but here we're getting a little bit more dialed in and a little bit in between developmental and line edits, where definitely there's some feedback still on world building, and she had one particular plot hole about the mechanics of the universe, which I've since kind of thought through a little bit more, but definitely went into a little bit more of that. And then in the final round of edits, I had sent back again another revised version, and in this third round, she mostly gave line edits and said, you know, she was excited to see it. It was pretty much more just polishing up at this point and making sure that the mechanics were all good, grammar was correct, and all of that looked good. There were still a few questions left, more in the line level, but not as much big picture feedback. So there's definitely a lot to be said about having a professional look over your work, especially one that has more familiarity with the literary sphere, literary agents, what they're looking for in particular, and how that might differ from a reader's perspective and generally whether they'd like it. I think there's a lot more leniency, especially in opening pages, from a reader where they, you know, will kind of generally like it more often than not. And there's definitely a spectrum of that, right? There's people who have harsher critiques than others, but the literary agent who reads so many of these will definitely need you to get to the point faster. And in particular, there needs to be a cohesiveness between all the materials. So this really helped me think through based on the order that a literary agent reads them, so the query and then the synopsis, and then the opening pages, not necessarily that they'll all read them in that order, but thinking about making sure that everything melds really well together and that I'm telling one cohesive story between the marketing materials and the story itself. I'll say one thing I wish I'd done differently is the timing. So I started this when I had already done a few different drafts and I've been working on it for a few years. I felt like my query and synopsis and first 10 pages were in a pretty good state. I'd done different rounds of beta readers and critique partners, but definitely there were so many different big picture developmental edits that I'm now writing a full draft from scratch. So if that's okay, and you're the kind of writer that you're like, okay, yes, I'm fine to throw it out the window, and you know, all of that would be writing for, and are willing to do that, then I think it's perfectly fine and, you know, good to do it at this point. But definitely, if you're going to do it after having written so much and being this far along in the process, I would be really open to more big picture changes and being like, okay, you know, we're going to make some big structural changes and then almost restart at this point. So I honestly think, and she says this on her website, that it could be a really good place to start from, where you're kind of in the plotting phase, even if you are a pantser, where you can get overall, make sure that, you know, the idea works, and even if it does evolve as you write, kind of make sure you really dial in those character motivations that'll drive the entire story. And I will say that even after finishing the third round, that's not the final version of those materials that I'm gonna query with. I have a lot of new ideas in the past 2 weeks. I've been doing a brainstorming frenzy to even further dial in the motivations of not just my two main characters, but every single character involved. And especially, like I said, since there's kind of a mystery underlying in the B plot of the entire story, I wanted to get the motivations of all the characters and that really dialed in. And based on that, I've had a lot of good ideas on how I'm going to change some of the world building to make it kind of fit the larger themes that I want a little bit more. So I definitely think it was worth it. I'm glad I did it. And I would highly recommend it if you're in the starting stages of your journey, and just recommend it with a disclaimer if you're kind of further along. But if you found this interesting or helpful at all, or you want to follow along with my journey, please like the video and subscribe down below, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye!